What do this bowl, this burger box and this cup have in common? They're all compostable. But do they really go back to nature, or is that just talking rubbish? Welcome to the show, where we're focusing on the environmental impact of packaging and asking whether it's better for it to decompose or be recycled. Also on today, as London hosts a net zero festival, what's the vibe there given the change in the political mood music? As the calm returns after Storm Ciarán, we take a look at the science behind the so-called bomb cyclone and rigs to reefs, how old oil platforms could have a surprising second life. But first, we're all about bowls and boxes, cups and containers in bulk. Many of us are all but addicted to takeaway food and drink. That means packaging, and that means waste. Some companies are pushing compostable containers, as customers appear to have an appetite for them.
If you knew that a company was using compostable packaging, would you be more likely to choose them?
Yes, absolutely.
Why
Because I think it means that they're taking steps to go in the right direction for society, and that's really important to me personally as a consumer.
But are they really a good solution? Time for a big bin dive. What am I looking at here, Sam?
Well, this particular area is called bagasse or biocane. It's actually made from the sugarcane product. So when you take sugarcane, you press it, you get the juice out for sugar, and you're left with this pulpy fibre called bagasse.
And that turns into this?
Eventually, yes.
A sudden change when we get to here, what looks like conventional plastic, to me at least.
Yeah, we actually had a lot of people, when we first put this onto the market, kind of come and say, you're just selling plastic. We have to explain to them, no, this is actually a plant-based plastic, so it's made from starch.
This warehouse isn't full of products, it's full of packaging for other products. It shows you quite what a massive industry packaging is and what a huge environmental footprint it can have. And being compostable suggests that they readily turn back to nature. But the problem is, compostables frequently turn out to be, well, not compostable, at least at home. Danielle Perkis ran an experiment involving hundreds of people over 2 years.
When we looked at some of these materials, especially the ones that have been certified as home compostable, which means they've been tested in a lab, much like this, we found that actually those materials didn't home compost in home composting timeframes, in people's own gardens, as had been promised on the label.
And there's another problem. Most homes lack a compost heap. Where should they put compostable packaging? Not in the recycling, as it is completely incompatible with the process and can contaminate the whole bin, meaning it would all go to landfill.
We haven't got the right labelling, messaging and collection in place to actually make that work. So right now, compostable packaging, the best place for it is to go into the bin.
A revelation for some.
I feel a bit lied to.
I feel a little bit betrayed, especially from all the advertising that you see these days.
God, I must tell my flatmates now, because we're always getting takeaway coffees and we always just we're like, oh yeah, we're doing so good for the environment, we'll just wash out and just throw it into the recycling. Okay, apparently not now.
So a lot of concern I hear about compostable plastics. I mean, the first is that they're not as compostable as you say. They don't break down as easily. How can you guarantee that they do break down, as you say?
I think the challenge we have, especially with home compostability, is people need to understand what a well-maintained compost heap. It isn't just putting a pile of leaves in a corner or burying it somewhere. It needs to have aeration and turned and churned regularly. In those compost areas, we find that it does break down properly, and that's what the official standard tests for.
Compostable containers do break down in well-run commercial facilities, but these are rare in the UK, and this scarcity, combined with poor home composting outcomes, has caused some environmentally minded companies to dump compostables.
We decided that we should remove it from our range until the industry could provide resources to actually process this waste. When we looked at the research that came out last year from UCL, we were quite shocked, and we couldn't guarantee to our customers that the packaging would actually be processed in the way that we were telling them that it was.
But manufacturers like Biopack insist compostable containers have a role with food. It doesn't matter if the containers are dirty. Contaminated plastic almost always gets burned or buried, whereas food on compostable packaging actually helps it to decompose.
Compostables aren't here to say, look, we need to replace every single plastic in existence with compostable plastic. It's a niche area. We say there's three main areas you should do it. Tea bags, put them in compostable plastic, because if it's in a plastic wrapper, you can't recycle the tea, you can't recycle the plastic. Put it in a compostable, you can recycle both, no problems at all. Second one is labelling for food, so when you have bananas, those labels that go on the outside, they need to be compostable, or else how can you recycle that banana peel? And the final one, which is the big one, is food service. You know, you go into any fast food restaurant chain, look in their bin, there's cardboard, there's plastic, there's ketchup, all over everything. And that's supposed to go to recycling. It doesn't, it all gets incinerated. It can all be composted though.
What you're saying, a great advantage of your material is it can be dirty and still have, if you like, an environmentally benign outcome.
That's the whole purpose of it. Compostable packaging isn't about composting this cup. It's about composting the food that is in the cup.
And that's the takeaway emerging from this rather murky picture. If you're sure it's compostable packaging, bin it with the food waste if that's collected in your area, and in the black bin if it's not. Just never with the recyclables. Now, London hosted a major gathering of businesses involved in the move to net zero this week. But with the sector seemingly out of favour politically, did they feel a little under siege? The Climate Show's Mickey Carroll went to find out.
We think that we have everything we need.
A net zero festival took place this week in London, at a time when net zero seems quite unfashionable, at least in Westminster.
We seem to have defaulted to an approach which will impose unacceptable costs on hard-pressed British families.
So what was the vibe like? The festival showcases technology and innovations that are either going to help us reduce our emissions or offset them. So let's see what we can find.
We've got a virtual experience of basically immersively into our woodlands. We can't bring our woods and trees here to the conference, so we're going to take you there through our VR headset.
What we've got on today is a game, a spin the wheel, where essentially what we will do is we will plant a tree in your name. What that will allow you to do is not just be able to say you've offset some tons of carbon, but also it's very good from a social perspective for farmers and things like that.
Great.
So if you want to play,
of course I
we
want
can
to play.
get the game up.
Of course I want to play. Although the Prime Minister might have been keen to put the brakes on parts of the transition, many of the big companies present here are still going full speed ahead.
It obviously it can be tricky when you hear kind of differences in priorities coming from policy. We want policy to be secure in this space, but it doesn't change the focus that we have on this. And I think there are so many businesses that you'll speak to that have the same perspective.
There's so much that's been done already in the sector and across industry. So keeping that momentum going is really important and key. And also the discussions and collaborations that have been happening anyway, regardless of government policy, are sure to continue.
And actually we think it's even more important now that we keep on telling that story and listening to and understanding all the positive things that are happening all around the country.
So, despite the change in political mood music, business is still singing from the old song sheet.
The UK still has net zero targets. It's still one of the most advanced economies in the world in pursuing those net zero targets. There are still multi-billion-dollar industries that are investing really aggressively in new clean technologies. So, you know, there's frustration, but also there is still a real sense of optimism around this agenda.
Is tackling climate change at odds with the cost of living crisis that people are facing today?
They are only at odds if you make a policy choice to put them at odds.
With a breakdown in consensus politics over net zero, can a strong political case still be made for it? Alistair Campbell gave a keynote speech about just that.
If you're talking about cheaper bills, greater protection against the Putins and the petrostates of this world, and a kind of better, brighter future for your kids, what is not to love about that as a political strategy? The fact that you can have an event like this, that there are so many people. If you went around, I mean, you can spot the people that would have been here 10 years ago, but you can spot plenty of people that wouldn't have been here 10 years ago, and that's because I think the debate has shifted.
And it's a debate that will be tested before long, with a general election looming. Mickey Carroll, Sky News.
Now, we're off to a break now, but when we come back in the aftermath of Storm Ciarán, as communities clean up, can they expect to see more of such events? And why are some environmentalists in California fighting to keep old oil platforms in place? Welcome back to the show. Now, Thursday saw Storm Ciarán rip through the south coast, Channel Islands and western France, leaving widespread damage in its wake. The so-called bomb cyclone rapidly intensified as it crossed the Atlantic, setting a number of records. Ashna Hurinag witnessed the damage in St Clement in Jersey.
We know extreme weather can be damaging, and this shows the sheer scale of it. Here in Jersey, the clean-up has already started. Look at the impact of the winds here, smashing glass windows on these cars. Look at the tiles on that roof, lifted off by the force of that wind, some of it flying into the houses on this street, causing absolute panic and terror for the people living here. If I take you through to this children's playground, we can see a bit more of some of that devastation. There were tiles along this floor. Look at this mangled fence just here. This lamppost just behind it, grey lamppost, has totally been bent on that side. And this huge wall, 6 foot high it was, has been completely flattened. These bricks, huge and also incredibly heavy, have just been thrown carelessly. People here saying it happened within minutes. Look at the fencing of this playground, ended up through someone's window. This is the sheer scale of the damage and destruction here in Jersey. It is going to take a lot of time, effort and community spirit, quite frankly, to get this back to normal again. All of this happened, as I say, some people saying within minutes or seconds. Truly shocking.
Well, what is the science behind the storm, and can we expect to see more like this? Well, to drill down into that, I'm joined by Sky's weather presenter, Steph Golter. Steph, welcome. And first of all, why was this storm so devastating?
It all started in North America. This is the time of year we've got really cold air from Canada digging down and interacting with some really warm air that's feeding up from the Gulf of Mexico. And where you get the contrast of the temperatures, that is where it sets off some very strong winds high up in the atmosphere. Those then barrel across the Atlantic towards us, and that's the jet stream that we can see here. And with this temperature contrast over North America, because it was so intense, we had winds in that jet stream over 200 miles an hour.
200 miles an hour. That explains something I heard, that jets were coming over, jets themselves, aeroplanes, were coming over incredibly quickly from North America, landing potentially at least an hour earlier. And someone told me that they were actually going at 770 miles an hour over land, not in the air pocket in which they were sitting, but actually over land. And that is technically faster than the speed of sound, which is extraordinary for a regular airliner. So that was what we've just seen. What about this weekend and maybe on into the winter? What can we expect?
Well, Ciarán was brought along by the jet stream. It steered it. It made sure it was very intense. We've got another one, Domingo, that's affecting the western parts of Europe as well, particularly parts of France and into the northern parts of Spain as well. Lots of rain on that, lots of very strong winds as well. We're just to the northern edge, so we'll see some rain, but nothing as severe as what we've just seen.
Yeah, now, it's worth pointing out there that they actually had it worse within the northern western France than we did, and this next storm coming in looks like it's tracking south. I mean, up to a point, we dodged a bit of a bullet here. We could have had it a lot worse.
Absolutely. Had it been a little bit further north, and I'm only talking about 150 miles, it would have been a very different story. And the whole densely populated south coast would have been hit by weather similar to Jersey.
Wow, that would have been pretty horrific. Now, that's this weekend. What about on into the winter? I know it's always difficult to say for weather forecasters months ahead, but what do you got?
Always take a long-range forecast with a pinch of salt. But at the moment, we're looking at things like El Nino. We're also looking at the Indian Ocean that has a similar kind of temperature pattern as well that changes. And they indicate that it's going to stay quite wet, at least for the first part of the winter. And depending on what El Nino does, maybe we'll see a little bit colder during the second half. But the first few months, not looking great.
Warmish, wet, windy, those three W's, not my definition of my favourite kind of winter, I have to say. One other thing I've heard is that there was a particularly low pressure. I wonder if you could put a figure on it and give me a feeling of what that actually means, maybe in practice. 953.3
hectopascals. That was the pressure. It's the lowest that we've seen in November, the lowest on record. And what you might have noticed, if you're an avid tea drinker, is that your tea tasted a little bit dodgy because the pressure is what dominates the temperature that water boils.
Right. So I think the water always boils at 100 degrees C, but that's not necessarily the case.
Absolutely not. Depends on the pressure. So because the pressure was so low, it was boiling at 98.4 degrees. So a good couple of degrees less.
Not quite as scalding, but still pretty tasty. And just one other thing I've heard about low pressure, which could be relevant in these times, is it can end up, in effect, sucking the sea up. The sea level can rise a bit in very low pressure.
That's right. Basically, pressure on its own doesn't mean a great deal. It's pressure in relation to other things.
Right.
So if the pressure next to you is very high, but over here it's very low, it's squashing together. That's the problem. And then you get your strong winds, and that's when you might see sort of higher sea level in one place than the other.
I gather that's partly what led to that devastating, what they call the Great Storm in the 1950s that flooded such a lot of the southeast. Well, absolutely fascinating to indulge some of these passions for both of us. Steph Golter, thank you very much indeed. Now, offshore oil rigs aren't necessarily the kind of places you'd think would be teeming with wildlife, but it turns out off the coast of California and in the Gulf of Mexico, they are. And that's led to an argument over what to do with them at the end of their lives. Well, someone who thinks we should largely clean them up and leave them there is Amber Sparks from the Blue Latitudes Foundation, where she's co-president. Well, thanks very much for being with us. First of all, straight question, why can rigs be good for wildlife?
Well, oil platforms are really unique. They are almost like the scaffolding of a building with beams and cross beams. They create a lot of real estate nooks and crannies for marine life to grow on and develop. And over time, these structures that were placed out in the ocean to produce oil and gas have turned into these de facto artificial reefs. And in California, they're some of the most productive ecosystems on the planet.
And have we had them in there long enough since they've been decommissioned to actually see the proof of this?
Yes, so many of these structures have been offshore for decades. And so the marine life, the ecosystems are fully developed. So when it comes time to decommission or completely remove those structures, the oil companies have to ask the question, is it more environmentally friendly to leave this structure in place or completely remove it?
So what do you need to do to a rig to make it clean and safe after it's finished producing to make it compatible with wildlife?
So through the decommissioning process, the oil companies will seal and cap the wells. And they do this by pouring cement, and they retain liability for those wells in perpetuity. So should there ever be a leak or a spill, they're always responsible. But if they decide to reef a structure or repurpose it, they would remove the topside, or what you would see from your beach chair. Those wells are sealed and capped, and then they'd modify the platform jacket in some way, either cutting it down maybe 80 feet below the water's surface to allow ships to safely draft over, or they might tow it to an area of ecosystem need or topple it in place.
All right, so you might actually move it to somewhere else, or as you say, make it fall over. So it's not necessarily a column where it always was.
Yeah, there's a couple different options for rigs to reefs, and leaving it in place definitely retains the most marine life because you are, not disturbing it or moving it to another habitat.
What are you and your colleagues actually doing to promote this idea of rigs to reefs and getting it to happen more often?
The Blue Latitudes works on assessing these offshore platforms as reefs. So we use remotely operated vehicles and do ecological value assessments on the structures to determine which structures would make for viable reefs and which ones should be removed.
What about the feeling that we should really clean up our mess? We put these things in the sea, they weren't a natural thing. When they've done their business at delivering us energy, we should get rid of them. That just feels like responsible behavior.
Oh, completely it does. And I'm a marine scientist who goes out to find opportunities to conserve our ocean resources. So why would we ever want to work with oil and gas? But what we found is that these structures kind of set a new precedent for marine conservation. It's no longer us against them, but can we find ways to work together to conserve and protect our oceans? And perhaps the future of ocean conservation is going to have to be a little bit more creative. How can we find ways that perhaps capitalize on opportunities like these reefs that have developed beneath oil platforms?
It can be seen, or it feels sometimes like a way of the oil and gas companies just dodging their financial responsibility for cleaning up their mess. Are they getting away cheaply here?
So the oil companies definitely do save money by leaving a portion of the structure in place. But in areas where there are active rigs to reef programs, about 50% of that cost savings goes back to the state to fund departments of fish and wildlife. It goes into an endowment for marine preservation and conservation. So we like to see it as a win-win, a win for the oil companies as well as a win for the state.
And is there an advantage to the local economy in turning these into reefs? I mean, I can get that it could be good for the wildlife. What about the people who live nearby?
Absolutely, especially in areas where there's a big commercial recreational fishing contingency. Leaving these structures in place could be very valuable to the local economy because they provide a habitat for fisheries that are valuable and provide a local source of income and a fishing hotspot for many of our local commercial and recreational fishermen.
I don't know if you're able to comment on this, but as you know, we have a lot of oil and gas rigs around the UK, particularly in the North Sea, many of which are coming to the end of their life. Do you know, or do you think that this rigs to reef idea would be compatible there?
I think there's definitely an opportunity for it in the North Sea. And there have been a couple research groups that are investigating how the structures in the North Sea have developed into reefs and would they actually be beneficial to be left in place. But each platform would need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis to really fully understand the impacts of leaving it there.
Now, before we go, a bit of good news, still with a marine flavour. You'll have heard about the devastating impact of bird flu, particularly on seabirds. But now there's evidence of growing levels of immunity. Professor Ian Brown from the Animal and Plant Health Agency led the study.
Avian influenza is caused by a virus which can infect a broad range of bird species, primarily domestic birds, chickens, turkeys, ducks. But this particular strain we're dealing with now has also got the ability to infect and spread amongst a very large number of wild bird species, including seabirds, where of course the virus has had quite devastating impact. We have got data now which supports the fact that in gannets, for example, which were very severely affected 2 summers ago, the effects were much less last summer, and we have detected immunity to this specific strain of virus. So that's encouraging signs because it tells us that in a population there will always be a proportion of individuals that get exposed to this virus and sadly get sick and die, but there'll also be a proportion that start building an immune response. The good news at the moment is the virus we're dealing with is a very optimal virus. It likes being in birds, it's highly infectious. But it does seem at the moment, provisional data is, that there's a little bit of a decline in the number of wild birds that are infected, and that's translating into less cases into domestic birds. This research program has really built some really important findings that have relevance at international level, and we're moving into a new program of work, and hopefully we'll get into a position where we can better predict where this will occur, more certainty about why different species of wild birds are becoming infected, which ultimately will feed into much improved interventions and control in the future.
That's it for this week. Remember, you can catch up on all your climate and environment news on the Sky News website and app, or by scanning the QR code that's on your screen right now. Next week, we'll be looking at new rules over housing, which is trying to ensure that building actually helps nature rather than harming it.